Hi, Tyler.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
Good. How you doing?
I can't complain. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright of Blogging Heads TV, and this is The Wright Show. You are Tyler Cullis of the National Iranian American Council, or NIAC, and we're going to talk about Iran and the nuclear negotiations, which are approaching what seems to be a pretty firm deadline, and about which there's been a lot of controversy lately. Last week, there was this big Tom Cotton letter brouhaha that we'll talk about. There are questions being raised by Republicans, especially in the Senate, about whether President Obama has the authority to conclude a deal the way he thinks he does, and so on. Now, NIAC is in favor of a deal, and in that sense, you're an advocate, but we're not really here for you to sing the praises of a deal. Rather, you're here because you are something but authority on the legal issues involved. I've kind of noticed in following your writing, including a piece you did for the New York Times about a week ago. So I wanted to ask you about a bunch of issues involving national law, international law. But first, let's set the stage of kind of where we are. Negotiations have resumed. Like roughly today, I guess. And there is this deadline approaching, right? I guess what you hear most often is March 24th. And now what is the significance of that? Is that a firm deadline or what?
So the March 24th deadline is the congressionally imposed deadline. So the Democratic senators that had signed on to the Kirk-Menendez bill, under the impression that it would be delayed until the March deadline, took the 24th to be the deadline. This is partly the fault of U.S. negotiators because the State Department never clarified after the extension in November when the deadline would be in March. No one was sure if it was March 1st, if it was March 24th, or if it was March 31st. It was left open-ended for a reason. Congressional hawks took the initiative to define that deadline. But the negotiators continue to see March 31st as the deadline, and because Congress will be in recess starting the 27th, even into the beginnings of April, they feel they have time to work out a framework agreement.
Okay, so what happens then if there is no deal by March 24th? Congress swings into action in a way that Obama would find so detrimental that this becomes a de facto deadline, or what? What would happen?
I mean, they have 3 days. So March 27th, that is the last day before they go in recess for about 2 weeks. So if they cannot pass something in 3 days, and it is unlikely that they would be able to do so, or that Democratic senators would be willing to do so, especially with progress that has been made, I don't see them being able to pass legislation. Moreover, they don't know which legislation to pass.
Well, what roughly would be the heart of the legislation?
I mean, it's either the Kirk-Menendez bill, which would impose sanctions that the president could then waive.
It would impose sanctions right away.
It would impose sanctions right away, giving the president a 30-day waiver authorities.
And do we think this could be veto-proof, so that he couldn't just veto it and rid himself of it altogether?
I mean, it could be veto-proof, but the amount of Democratic senators that have signed on to delay the bill makes it seem as if this got to the floor for a vote and the president vetoed it, his veto would be overridden.
Okay. So sanctions, that's what one of the bills would do. And that would, you would think that might kind of blow things out of the water. What would the other bill do?
So the Corker-Menendez bill is supposed to be after a deal. So the Kirk-Menendez is before a deal, Corker-Menendez is after a deal. But a lot of people have shifted over to Corker-Menendez because there has been promise that a deal is emerging, and that would provide Congress the ability to vote up or down a nuclear deal and delay the implementation of a deal for 60 days while they make that vote. And if they vote down a deal, then it would rid the president of his ability to waive or relieve statutory sanctions.
Okay. So Congress would step in and say, wait a second, you can't do a deal without us voicing our opinion like right away at the very beginning. And do we think that would be veto proof? Is that kind of right on the edge of veto proof right now, given the number of Democrats who have expressed support?
It's right on the edge of veto proof. I mean, the question is, there's 2 votes that would be needed. So you can pass that bill. It would then delay the implementation of a deal for 60 days, but it wouldn't vote down a deal itself. So you would need two votes to override a veto before the president would be unable to relieve sanctions on Iran, to the point where this would cause real significant damage.
Okay. And then, as you've said, with both of these bills, I guess there's a question of whether Congress could get them done before recess if they swung into action on the 24th or whatever. That deadline may not be as firm as it sounds sometimes.
No, I mean, I think they have room until maybe the second week of April to get this deal.
Okay. Now, this leads us to the question of to what extent is Congress's approval needed. Before we get to that issue, that substantive issue, let's talk a little about the recent context. This Tom Cotton letter, freshman senator from Arkansas, Republican, Tom Cotton, got 46 of his Republican colleagues to join him in signing a letter to the Iranian leadership saying, as I understand it, listen, don't kid yourself. Obama may reach this agreement with you, but it can be undone at any future time by Congress and so on. So, and the subtext being kind of like, give up. We don't want a deal. Why don't you just give up on one? Is that a fair summary of kind of the upshot of the letter, or not?
Yeah, I mean, I think the letter was strategic. I mean, I agree. Some people in this town have written that, look, they were actually strategic in how they went about it. They want to foil a deal, and one way to foil a deal is tell the Iranians that the people you're negotiating with at the table aren't the right people. You need to negotiate with us because we hold the cards at the end of the day. So it's strategic in that sense because it warns off the Iranians from agreeing to a nuclear settlement. Mm-hmm. The upshot is that they've created such partisan rancor here that, especially when you look at a Corker-Menendez bill, which would provide a Republican Congress the ability to vote down a nuclear deal, do Democratic senators really want to give a Republican Congress that opportunity, especially in light of the Cotton letter and the unseriousness with which a lot of their Republican colleagues are dealing with the issue?
Right. And in fact, a number of people who are opposed to the deal were mad at Cotton and his colleagues because they thought maybe he had sabotaged the chances of getting Democrats to sign on to a different kind of effort to impede a deal in effect. And maybe that's why the New York Daily News, which is actually very right-wing on these things, had this, 47 traitors front page referring to these senators and so on. So they did get a lot of blowback, even from people who are like-minded on the Iran nuclear issue. But it doesn't seem to me that the fears of these people have really been borne out. It doesn't seem that they have slowed the momentum of the alternative bills that opponents of the deal are, or bills, actual legislation that opponents of the deal are pushing. And in a way, they may have the kind of extremism of the letter may have made the legislation seem relatively sober, right? What's your assessment of what the effect has been?
No, I mean, I think that's one of the dangers. One of the dangers is that the Cotton letter represents something so extreme that we saw editorials all across the country casting a negative light on their own GOP representatives who had signed on to the bill, and seeing the Corker-Menendez bill as this kind of sober alternative, the right way for Congress to weigh in on a deal. And I think that's a real danger. And I agree with you that we haven't seen some of the major supporters of these bills, especially Senator Tim Kaine, leave the bill in the way we would like, see the Republican Congress as something that really can't be negotiated with, and perhaps it's best that we insulate a nuclear deal from them. He went on the Senate floor last week and he said something to the effect of, this is one strike. There's going to be two strikes, but if there's a third strike, I might change my mind. And that was kind of the tone of what he said. Yeah. So if the Republican Congress does something like this in the near-term future, he might withdraw his support for the bill. But he hasn't done so far.
No, it doesn't sound to me like he plans to either. And then the other effect that the Cotton letter can have, and the one I suspect it was intended to have, the main effect I suspect it was intended to have, is to actually make the Iranians have doubts, or moreover, to strengthen the hardliners in Iran who kind of in parallel with the Republicans, many Republicans in America don't want a deal. It kind of gives them ammunition when the Iranian conservatives or hardliners are arguing against the deal, the letter kind of gives them ammunition, presumably. And I'm not convinced that the letter hasn't had some of that effect. For all I know, it has. I don't know if you have a view on that.
No, I mean, I think there's something really perverse about the letter. And what's really perverse about it is that the Iranians are intelligent enough to understand how the American system works. There's a really good piece in Reuters by Ali Vaez that discussed this issue, that, the Iranians have studied the American system for 35 years because it's the American system that has spent its time isolating it. So it knows it very well. But this is something, the letter is something that was raised during the talks this morning between Kerry and Zarif. That was one of the first things Zarif brought up. So really, Zarif is using this as a way to extract further concessions from the Americans by saying, look, we're not only negotiating with you, we're negotiating with 535 of your colleagues. And if 535 of your colleagues put at risk this deal, then we need something more to, have the security of entering into it in the first place.
Right.
So it's perverse in the sense that it forces actually the Americans to give more up at the table than they otherwise would do.
Right. An analogy I heard is like if you're lending money to someone, the more uncertainty there is as to whether they can actually repay you, the higher an interest rate you're going to charge. And I don't know if that holds, but and of course, that Tom Cotton would love that if the Iranians ask for so much that we can't deliver and the whole thing falls apart.
Mm-hmm.
Now let's get into the big question raised by the Cotton letter, the question of the administration's actual authority to do this deal. Well, first of all, I guess we should say that. Well, no, let's get into sanctions later. There's a whole bunch of different sanctions that would have to be repealed, and some of that would definitely have to involve Congress in the long run.
Yeah.
But leaving that aside, what is the question about whether this kind of deal can be struck by the president without explicit congressional authorization?
I don't think there's a question that the president can enter into this deal with the Iranians. We've seen, I thought the best piece was Jack Goldsmith, who's a former head of the Office of Legal Counsel here during the Bush administration, and Marty Lederman, who was a high-ranking lawyer in OLC during the Obama administration, authored a piece where they said, look, there's no question that the Obama administration can enter into a non-binding political commitment or political arrangement with the Iranians without needing the prior or later approval of Congress. There's no constitutional principle that prevents the administration from doing so.
But of course, non-binding makes it sound like not worth very much. But I gather that this has actually been done in the past with a number of agreements that wound up sticking. What exactly is the significance of that term, non-binding?
Non-binding means that the parties don't intend the agreement to be legally binding. That doesn't mean it doesn't have normative force on other terms. It could have normative force on moral terms. The expectation of compliance could be the exact same as if this was a legally binding agreement. I brought this up with the Washington Post last week, but Dennis McDonough, the chief of staff of the White House, did the same thing with the administration recently, with his letter to Congress this weekend, which said, look, there's some historical examples include the Atlantic Charter.
Is that you dinging or me?
Yeah, that's actually my wife. She's
your wife
messaging.
Nice voice. I like that. It's very melodic.
Yeah. The Helsinki Accords, the Shanghai Communique, the Atlantic Charter, all of these were non-binding political commitments,
mm-hmm.
political arrangements. None of them had legal force, and yet the party stuck to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you wrote a piece about that in the New York Times about the Helsinki Accord, that parallel. So when we say non-binding, we mean it's non-binding under international law. So a treaty gives you a legal commitment under international law when you enter into a treaty. And to violate a treaty is to violate international law in a sense, right? Is it that sense in which this is non-binding?
So you have to take two things apart. There's a treaty as a matter of U.S. law. There's a treaty as a matter of international law. Mm-hmm. They overlap to a great degree. They don't overlap completely. So you could have a treaty under U.S. law that is not a treaty under international law. That occasion would be more rare. But you could have something that's not a treaty under U.S. law that is a treaty under international law. And you see this a lot with congressional executive agreements here, where both houses of Congress will vote because the president enters into an agreement. That's not a treaty as a matter of U.S. law, but it is a treaty as a matter of international law. This non-binding means it won't be binding as a matter of international law.
In this case.
And all the rules that would have applied to a treaty as a matter of international law. You have the Vienna Convention on the law of treaties. You have customary rules to determine a breach. And all of these kinds of things won't apply to this agreement. So that's, you can think of that as a deficiency of the agreement. That there's a whole codification of rules to determine all kinds of things when it comes to treaties as a matter of international law. When a party breaches, what kinds of things can I do in response to a breach that won't be applicable in this case?
Okay. So what won't we be able to do by virtue of the fact that it's not a treaty? I mean, we won't. I mean, the truth is, it's not, treaties, don't have a very explicit formal mechanism of enforcement anyway. It's not like there's somewhere in The Hague, somebody who will slap your wrist if you violate a treaty. So it's kind of hypothetical anyway, right? I mean,
I think it matters even less because the Security Council is negotiating this agreement.
Right.
So the Security Council is creates its own legal instruments itself by its own force at the Security Council. So if it adjudges Iran to do something in violation of agreement, or if it sees Iran as being non-compliant, it can take action at the Security Council. So however it pleases. It doesn't need these rules.
Okay. So that brings us to this other issue that has arisen here, that, there will be Security Council action at the United Nations regarding an agreement, presumably, if there is an agreement. And that's partly because, in fact, the people negotiating the treaty on our side consists of all of the members of the Security Council who have a veto, all 4 members other than us who have a veto, plus Germany, I guess. And so we're doing the core of the Security Council is doing the negotiating, but moreover, a lot of the sanctions that would have to be repealed are Security Council sanctions. So there would have to be action by the Security Council for an agreement to work, right? And there is the expectation that that's going to happen. Now, discussion of this freaked out some of the Republicans who said, oh, so you're saying you're just going to do something at the Security Council and then the U.S. would be bound by that? And that, of course, brought out all of the issues about American sovereignty and we will not let the black helicopters from the UN come in and land in our kindergartens and stuff. And so what's the status of that? What is the likely thing that would happen with the Security Council?
No one knows. The Security Council will undertake some action endorsing the resolution. We know that much because both parties have said so. Mm-hmm. For the Iranians expect this to bind the United States to lift sanctions on the timeline agreed to under a deal. The Americans have hedged. If you watch the State Department briefings, the State Department spokesperson has hedged as to this question. Because this would be a way to translate a non-binding political arrangement into something binding as a matter of international law, and Bob Corker wasn't happy about this. But this all depends upon the wording of the resolution itself. Is it worded in such a way as to obligate the United States, or is it worded in such a way as it's kind of more loosey-goosey and that you don't see the kind of language you would expect to form a legal obligation. So, we don't know what it will look like. I think for the Iranians, it matters that it is a legal obligation. I think for the Americans, they would prefer it not to be so, and perhaps just for domestic political reasons. Because again, having a legal obligation works 2 ways. If nothing obligates us to do something, then nothing is going to obligate the Iranians to do something in return. So if obligation is imposed on us, we can't impose that obligation on the Iranians. So, this is a two-way street here, and it'll be interesting to see what they decide to do.
Right.
Right.
So yeah, I think what I think is the case that a lot of people don't realize is that if the Security Council orders a member of the United Nations to do that, to do something that under legitimate authority given the UN Charter, that nation is actually obliged to do it under. I mean, we signed the treaty that created the United Nations, actually granting certain powers to the Security Council. And so this is what people have in mind. This is what Republicans fear, I guess, is that Obama might do a Security Council resolution that in effect kind of commands Congress to repeal the sanctions almost, right?
I mean, it could. I mean, Congress doesn't have to do so. The Congress could act in ways contrary to U.S. treaty obligations.
But then, strictly speaking, that would be a violation of a pre-existing treaty commitment, and strictly speaking, a violation of international law.
That would be
that Republicans would be cowed by that. Don't get me wrong, but technically,
yeah, I mean that would be a violation of the Security Council resolution. And if the resolution is drafted in such a way to be self-executing as a matter of U.S. law, which is entirely possible, then it would be a violation of U.S. law as well. So, Republican Congress is not happy about this potential scenario. I expect the White House to draft the language of a resolution in such a way that both parties can claim a win. So it's going to be ambiguous as to whether it obligates anybody.
Yeah, I suspect that they are not going to invite the trouble they'd invite if the Security Council made some sort of explicit demand on the sanctions. I mean, I think in the end, Congress, a lot of the sanctions that have to be repealed were mandated by the U.S. Congress. Now, they tend to let the president suspend them. The legislation governing these sanctions tends to give the president the authority to suspend them for a period of time. And you might see a lot of that at the beginning of an agreement, and Obama would have the legal right to do that. But ultimately, for the agreement to last in the long run, Congress has to repeal some of these sanctions, right?
It's theoretically true. I think from the perspective of
which part is theoretical, that Congress has to ultimately repeal them, or that Obama can suspend them in the first place?
The part that's theoretical is that in order for a deal to work, Congress would ultimately need to terminate the sanctions. I think it matters to the Iranians that the sanctions are terminated.
I think so, yeah.
I don't see a time in the near-term future where legislation could be brought before Congress removing sanctions, and a Congress would go ahead with that legislation. Maybe I'm myopic, but I just don't see that being a reality for some time to come. And I think the White House has understood that. But I say theoretically because these existing sanctions provide the president enormous room to suspend the operation of sanctions, to license otherwise prohibited activities and or transactions, to take parties off the specially designated nationals list. From the perspective of the White House and probably the people advising the White House at the Treasury Department, there's enormous room for the president to, temper the sanctions in such a way that foreign business is invited back into Iran. And Iran can sell its oil, it can move its money around the world, all kinds of things like that. And I expect there to be some significant relief at the front end of any deal, not just from the Europeans and the Security Council, but also from the Americans. And mostly because it needs to happen.
Sure, but I think I think two things. First of all, I think the people from the Obama administration, I think, have been assuring Congress that Congress would ultimately play some role, right? Haven't they kind of said that? And separate from that, isn't it the case that in the longest run, some of the sanctions at least would require congressional action for permanent repeal?
I think the way to think about this is that we're in a negotiation and we want something from the Iranians. So, for instance, ratification of the additional protocol. The Iranians want something from us, repeal of U.S. statutory sanctions on Iran. And because we're in a negotiation, the Iranians are probably telling the Americans, look, If you don't repeal the sanctions, we're not going to ratify the AP. And you can tie those two things together. So you can put pressure on both parties. You can put pressure on Iran's parliament. You can put pressure on the U.S. Congress that if you want to see the other party take action as to this thing that matters to you, then you need to take reciprocal action.
Right.
And I think that's the way you're going to see it styled.
Well, that's why I personally think, as hostile as Congress sounds toward this, or at least, mainly the Republicans in Congress, but some Democrats, I think in the law, if you let very much time pass and say, okay, Congress, here's your chance. You can blow this whole thing apart, or you can pass legislation that affirms the deal. I think as a political matter, it would be harder than people realize for Congress not to affirm the deal, because then they're really staring into the abyss and they have to ask themselves the question, well, wait a second, what happens if we don't stick with this deal? Because the deal is going to bring, because Iran will presumably continue to be in compliance as they have been since the interim deal. And Iran will have agreed to this additional thing you alluded to, the additional protocol, which would mean for the first time inspectors could look at locations aside from the officially declared nuclear sites if they got suspicious about some kind of covert arms program. So it'd be a lot of benefits. It might it might seem like the alternative is war, and I think it would be harder than people think for Congress to say no to that. Although certainly right now they don't sound in a mood to say yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends upon where in the timeline we would expect Congress to take this action. I mean, if it's earlier on, then I think you're right, because you need to induce Iranian compliance because it matters to you. If it's later in the timeline, if we're talking year 10, 12, 15, then Congress might not see necessarily the benefit in terminating the sanctions because its benefit is at its rope's end. Some things will last beyond the term of a deal, including such things as Iran's ratification of the additional protocol, maybe, some verification measures above and beyond that. But, the farther we go down, there's an inequity in the sense that the farther we go into this deal, Iran sustains its burden at the beginning and sees its benefit at the end. Mm-hmm. And the Americans see the benefit at the beginning and their burden at the end. And I think there's that imbalance that puts at risk Congress taking appropriate action at the end of a deal.
So wait, run that by me again. What's the asymmetry in the beginning? Who gets the big benefit and who bears the big burden at the beginning?
I mean, I think the burden is on the Iranians because they will be forced to have pretty strict nuclear constraints for 10 years, let's say. You'll see those nuclear constraints last 10 years. After that 10 years, or after, and especially after the conclusion of a deal, their program will be treated in the same manner as all other signatories to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. For the U.S., the benefit is those exact constraints on Iran's program. The burden for the U.S. is actually lifting the sanctions, if you wanted to think of it as congressional repeal. That's the U.S.'s burden. But that burden won't be sustained until the very end of a deal. So you see
I thought Iran was going to insist on you mean the formal lifting as opposed to the president using his power to suspend?
Correct. Formal lifting.
Okay.
Yeah,
That's true, although we should say, I think, a burden, people would argue about the term burden. I mean, a lot of economists would say it's win-win to lift these sanctions. Sanctions tend to hurt parties on both sides of them. That's the way they are, because commerce tends to be good for both parties, economists say. So it's kind of a political burden more than an economic burden. There's a lot of economic interest in the United States, companies and so on, that want the sanctions lifted.
Yeah, I mean that could well be the case too. I mean, I think we're going to see. I'm skeptical that the U.S. trade ban will be implicated in any way for this deal. And I actually, one of Iran's negotiators, Ravanchi, had said yesterday that European companies will get the benefit and American companies will receive the burden because the U.S. trade ban isn't going anywhere.
A U.S. trade ban is a particular that is part of the American unilateral sanctions regime.
Yeah, so that's been imposed since 95, 96.
But a deal would not contemplate the lifting of that because that's not related to the nuclear program in the first place?
It is related to the nuclear program. it's related to a whole range of items, but it is a nuclear-related sanction. But I think the way the White House thinks about it is that lifting the comprehensive trade ban would be a step too far domestically for it. And to the Iranians, I'm not sure it matters all that much, especially if you're going to get the advantage of European companies coming into Iran.
Yeah, well, if I'm the American Chamber of Commerce, I'd want in on that action, but I guess we're not going to get in on it. So that, of course, one thing Iran could do, I mean, you're envisioning a situation where, 10 years from now, you're saying early on, America has a strong incentive to make it in Iran's interest for Iran to abide by the terms of the deal. But you're saying 10 years out, after the tenure of this particular deal has expired, and Iran is just kind of a regular member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty again, not under special supervision, although there would continue to be inspections and stuff, right?
Right.
You're saying then America doesn't have such a strong incentive to do whatever is required, like lift sanctions. But I would say that Iran can at any point threaten to just leave the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which the treaty itself gives members the right to do on, I think, 6 months' notice, right? So, that might be an extreme step, but I would think that would really get the attention of people in Congress, because that would mean then that Iran could build a nuclear weapon without violating international law, which so long as they're in the NPT, they can't do.
Yeah, I mean, I think from the Iranians' perspective, the danger in this is that it is harder for them to take reciprocal action, because especially if it's the case that over this 10, 15-year period, you see European and Asian firms coming into Iran, you see Iran starting to be integrated into the global financial community, and Iran taking a radical step like leaving the NPT could put at risk all of those things. The argument back to me is, well, then what does American action mean at the end of the day? If the United States decides not to terminate the sanctions, does it have an effect? I mean, the Iran Sanctions Act existed for 10 years before a single enforcement action took place. I mean, it was just, totally impotent in doing anything to Iran. The U.S. trade ban will be the same way. The U.S. doesn't conduct any trade with Iran these days. So what exactly does a trade ban in place do to Iran? It doesn't do that much, especially when European companies are engaging in trade with Iran. So I think, that's why I think Congress lifting sanctions at the end of a deal, what matters is what happens within that 10 to 15-year period. Whether Congress decides to lift sanctions is its prerogative. If it does do so, I think that's a useful measure. If it doesn't do so, I don't think it hurts Iran, and I think it probably damages the United States more than the Islamic Republic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess so. Now, on that, so as long as we're talking about the Non-Proliferation Treaty, there is this issue of whether Iran has, quote, the right to enrich under the treaty. Because, of course, the kind of hardliners in the United States and, Bibi Netanyahu, their position is Iran should not be able to enrich uranium at all, even for the purpose of generating nuclear energy for Iranians. And this has been a big issue because the current deal definitely does let them do low-level enrichment. And so there's been controversy over whether they have a, quote, right to enrich under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. What's your view on that?
I mean, I don't think this is a really controversial question for those who are familiar with international law. I mean, you can either identify a right in Article 4 of the NPT, which allows for the development of the production of nuclear energy. I mean, some legal scholars think that a right to enrich uranium is contained within that, because how else shall we produce nuclear energy?
Well, you could. What they would say is, what the opponents would say is, you could import processed uranium, I guess, and feed it into your reactors without you doing the enriching yourself. You could import the enriched uranium, right?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I just don't think that's the way it was understood at the time.
Well, and in fact, there are members of the NPT who are enriching, right? Doesn't Japan enrich uranium or something?
Yeah, I mean, there's I think maybe a dozen and a half members that enrich. But that even that doesn't answer the question because there's a background principle of international law. It's called the Lotus Principle, an old turn of the 20th century case that basically lays out that which is not prohibited,
Right.
a state is free to do.
Right.
So, and no one has ever identified a prohibitory rule in international law stating that a state cannot enrich uranium.
Right. There certainly is no such thing, in fact.
Yeah, there's no such thing. So, I mean, you can call it a right. You can say they have the freedom to do it. But, this until you identify a prohibitory rule under international law that does not allow them to enrich, I mean, they can enrich. I mean, there's just not a controversial question.
Right. I mean, it's like on a more local level, I have the right to walk down the sidewalk on the street I live on. There's nothing in a municipal ordinance or a state law that guarantees me that right. It's just not forbidden. So I can do it. And international law is the same way.
Exactly.
Now, there is an irony in that some of the people protesting that Iran does not have the right under international law to enrich uranium do not seem to feel bound by international law in other contexts. For example, they want to bomb Iran. Now, that would clearly and undeniably be a violation of international law, right?
I mean, yeah, I'm a big fan of Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, which prohibits the threat or use of force. I mean, if you wanted to be serious about it, every time a U.S. official repeats the mantra, all options are on the table, that is a threat of the use of force, contrary to the principles of the Charter.
So is even the threat of the use of force forbidden by the Charter?
Yeah, I mean, the threat or the use of force is the language of Article 2.4, which is kind of the bedrock principle of international law. I mean, there's not a bigger principle of international law than that one.
Right.
And the threat of the use of force is as illegal as that use of force would be itself.
Now, what hawks sometimes say is, well, we would bomb them because they were in violation of UN Security Council mandates or something. That's what some people claimed about Iraq. But even that, the mere perceived violation or the mere actual violation of a Security Council resolution does not permit any given nation to take it into its own hands to punish the transgressor, right? I mean, the punishment of the transgressor is only itself legal under international law if the Security Council authorizes it, right?
I mean, that's correct. I mean, there's actually something really interesting that no one's ever brought up about the Security Council resolutions in regards to Iran. And that is, it is the first instance in the history of the Security Council that the Council adopted a Chapter 7 resolution without first identifying a threat to the peace.
Because
there's no language in their threat to the peace. And the reason for that was because Russia and China didn't want to see what happened in the case of Iraq happen again. So they refused to allow the Council itself to find a threat to the peace. And incidentally, this is why Iran argues that all the resolutions were taken ultra vires, beyond the powers of the Security Council, because the finding of a threat to the peace is the precondition for the Council to take Chapter 7 action. If there's no threat to the peace, the Council shouldn't be able to take enforcement action under Chapter 7. It did so regardless, but the whole reason for that is exactly the argument you presented, is that they did not want the United States to unilaterally interpret a resolution in such a way as to permit the use of force against Iran.
Okay, because Chapter 7 says the Security Council can authorize use of force for the sake of international peace and security or something like that, right?
Yeah, correct.
Okay. So there is this kind of irony, I guess, about people very concerned with one aspect of international law being much less concerned with another aspect of it. I guess, finally, or close to finally, is it clear whether it was a violation of international law when we collaborated with Israel to do these Stuxnet attacks? These were cyber attacks on Israel's nuclear facilities that, unlike many cyber attacks, actually did physical damage. They actually made centrifuges like spin out of control or something like that, right? Is that a violation of international law, or is the whole business of cyber warfare too new for us to say?
I mean, it's an unsettled question.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, people are developing theories of how to figure out whether a cyber attack would constitute a violation of Article 2.4, so it would be an unlawful use of force. But that point, that it constituted a physical attack against Iran, is exactly the reason people give for why it could constitute a violation of the use of force.
Right.
That it did cause physical attack, and that should be the parameters under which we define use of force.
Okay. All right. Well, I think we've kind of covered a lot of the waterfront. Anyway, is there anything else you want to say about any aspect of this?
No, I think, I mean, to me, this was all, I mean, this is kind of a fabricated crisis. You know, we knew all the way back during the JPOA that the administration...
This is the joint operating agreement that was kind of the interim agreement that was...
the Joint Plan of Action back in November 2013 was styled in exactly the same way to be a non-binding political arrangement. And we knew all the way back then, from when they first announced the title of a final deal, which would be a Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, that this was going to be a political arrangement all the same. The idea that, you know, Wendy Sherman was briefing Congress back in July 2014 that, you know, the executive can enter into this agreement on the basis of its sole authority. So, you know, senators knew this all the way back in the day. The idea that they are bringing it up now suggests that the parties are actually close to an agreement, and people are getting worried about it.
Is your sense that they really are close to an agreement? You're closer to this than I am.
I think they're really close.
Do you think they'll do it by March 24th?
I don't know if they'll do it by March 24th. But I do think that it will be by March 31st.
So you're betting on, I mean, you think the chances are appreciably greater than 50% of an agreement?
I think so, yeah.
Okay. Well, we'll see. I'm
hopeful. I've always been hopeful, though.
Yeah. There's two kinds of people, hopeful and not hopeful. I'm not hopeful. The final thing, we should kind of reinforce this. One thing that would endure, I'm not sure if we did, but maybe, but one thing that would endure from the deal beyond any 10-year is Iran's signing on to the additional protocol of the NPT, right? Which would mean for the first time these on-site inspections can be done. International inspections can say, wait, you have to show me this, you have to show me that, right?
Yeah, I mean, it would be a measurable improvement over the safeguards agreement that Iran has with the International Atomic Energy Agency. And it would allow the IAEA to do things that it otherwise would not be able to do. So it would be a measurable improvement. It would be kind of the gold standard in agency inspections. And it would last ad infinitum. So, you know, there would be no end to this.
And some members of the NPT have not signed on to the additional protocol, right? I mean, it's kind of a technically voluntary thing that was created to fix a perceived flaw in the NPT, which is that they didn't have off-site inspections. But as a technical matter, it's members choose whether or not to sign on to the additional protocol, and then if they do, they have to abide by it.
Yeah, I mean, this is totally voluntary. I mean, the Iranians had voluntarily implemented it between the 2003-2005 period, and had then chosen to, you know, use it as a point of leverage in negotiations. But, you know, once there is a deal, I don't think the Iranians are, you know, opposed to implementing the additional protocol ad infinitum.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. We'll be on the edge of our seats in the coming weeks to see if this happens. But thanks a lot for taking the time, Tyler.
No, thanks a lot too, Bob.
Okay. Bye-bye.